Priya Sharma thought she had found her golden ticket to a new life in Canada, while Richard Donovan believed his secret affair with the young Indian student would remain hidden forever. But what began as a passionate escape quickly spiraled into lies, betrayal, and a deadly visa scam that neither of them could control. Anika Sharma was 24 years old when she left India for Toronto with a suitcase full of borrowed clothes, a small savings account her parents had scraped together, and a heavy burden of expectations. She had grown up in a modest home where the walls were cracked, but dreams were painted over them in bright colors. Her parents believed that if she studied abroad, she could break free from the cycle of limited opportunities that had defined their lives. She believed it too, and for a while the idea of studying in Canada felt like a golden ticket. Yet reality struck her hard the moment she landed in Toronto. The city was beautiful, filled with shining towers, bustling streets, and endless possibilities, but everything came at a price. Rent consumed most of her funds, groceries took what remained, and the part-time cafe job she managed to secure paid barely enough to keep her afloat. Nights often ended with her counting coins in her small apartment, the thought of failure pressing on her chest like a weight she could not lift. Anika's program at the university was demanding. Between assignments, long shifts at work, and the constant stress of financial insecurity, she found herself slipping further into exhaustion. Her classmates came from wealthy families, attending parties and wearing designer clothes while she hid the shame of reusing outfits. To escape her growing despair, she sometimes attended campus events where wealthy donors mingled with students. It was at one of these events, a charity gala hosted at a grand hotel, that her life took a turn she never could have imagined. She had no business being there, but a friend from her class gave her a spare ticket, and curiosity drove her through the hotel's glittering glass doors. The evening was dazzling. Crystal chandeliers lit up the ballroom, and waiters drifted past carrying trays of champagne. Guests laughed in elegant suits and gowns, their voices rising above the soft background music. Anika felt small and invisible, but she also felt alive. For a moment, she let herself believe she belonged in that world. Then she noticed him, Richard Callahan. He was in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark, tailored suit. His hair was silver at the temples, his smile polished from years of commanding attention. He was the kind of man who carried his wealth like armor, untouchable and assured. But when his eyes met hers across the room, she realized she was not invisible after all. Richard approached her with the easy confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. He asked her name, her background, and though his tone was polite, there was an undercurrent of curiosity. Anika was nervous yet flattered. She knew he was wealthy, powerful, and married. She had overheard someone mention his name in company earlier in the night, but she could not resist the pull of his attention. He listened when she spoke, complimented her ambition, and made her feel seen in a way no one else had in months. That night ended with Richard offering her his number under the guise of mentorship. Anika accepted it without hesitation, unaware that this small exchange would mark the beginning of a dangerous path. Days turned into weeks, and their encounters became more frequent. At first, their meetings were innocent enough. Richard took her to expensive restaurants she had only seen in magazines, showing her corners of the city she never could have afforded. He gave her books on business, spoke about success, and framed their connection as guidance. But soon, boundaries blurred. Gifts appeared, jewelry, handbags, money slipped into her purse with a quiet smile. When she protested, he told her she deserved them. Slowly, his mentorship evolved into something else entirely. Their secret affair was born, carried in the shadows of Toronto's bright skyline. For Anika, the change was intoxicating. She had spent months worrying about rent, food, and tuition, and suddenly those fears began to melt away. Richard covered her bills, paid her tuition balance, and even offered to support her family back home. Her apartment was replaced by a more comfortable one in a better neighborhood. She felt as if she had finally stepped into the life she had always wanted, one where she was admired, cared for, and financially secure. But underneath the glamour, an unease grew inside her. She knew Richard was married, and every time she saw his name in business magazines or on television, she remembered the image of his perfect family that the world admired. She told herself she was only borrowing a piece of his life, but deep down she knew that if their secret came out, it would destroy everything. Still, the more she tried to ignore the risks, the deeper she sank. She became addicted to the lifestyle, to the sense of control she felt when Richard leaned on her as his escape from a marriage that seemed, from his words, hollow and loveless. He confided in her about his frustrations, the pressures of his business empire, and the distance between him and his wife, Margaret. The more he spoke, the more she believed she had a place in his life that was more than temporary. Yet a quiet voice in her mind kept warning her that men like Richard never left their wives, and women like her were always replaceable. Her fears of being discarded were not just about love, they were about survival. Her student visa would expire soon, and she knew returning to India meant going back to the same cycle she had fought so hard to escape. That fear grew larger with every passing day, overshadowing the glittering life she now lived. She looked at Richard not just as a lover but as her lifeline, a man who could secure her future in Canada. She told herself that if she played her cards right, she could have both love and security. She could belong to this world permanently, not just as a visitor. What Annika did not realize was that Richard was playing a game of his own. To him, she was a distraction, a secret he carefully hid from his family and colleagues. He never saw her as permanent, no matter how much he showered her with gifts. He lived in two worlds, one of wealth and status, another of secrecy and indulgence, and he believed he could keep them separate forever. Annika's growing desperation, mixed with Richard's recklessness, was like a spark near dry wood. Neither of them understood how quickly their choices could ignite into something uncontrollable. On the surface, it seemed like an affair between a lonely student and a married millionaire, but underneath a storm was building. Every decision Annika made, every lie Richard told, and every moment they spent together pulled them deeper into a dangerous web. The glamour was only a mask, hiding shadows that waited patiently for the right time to reveal themselves. By the end of that first year in Toronto, Annika had transformed. She was no longer the shy girl counting coins in her small apartment. She was now dressed in designer clothes, attending exclusive events and riding in expensive cars. But she was also carrying secrets heavy enough to crush her, secrets that would soon spiral out of her control. She believed she had outsmarted fate by tying her life to Richard's, but fate was only waiting to show her how wrong she was. Annika's new life felt almost unreal. She moved from counting coins at her cafe job to swiping a black credit card Richard had given her. Her tuition was paid, her fridge was full, and her wardrobe looked like something from glossy magazines. But beneath the luxury, her mind was restless. Every time she checked her visa papers, the dates glared back at her like a ticking clock. She had less than a year before it expired, and the thought of being forced to leave Canada terrified her. Going back to India meant losing everything she had built, and she was not ready to return to cramped rooms, limited opportunities, and the disappointment of her parents who had believed so strongly in her. She started to think of ways to secure her future. Marriage was the obvious path, but Richard was married, and despite the whispered promises he made in their quiet moments, she knew he would never risk his empire for her. Divorce would cost him millions, and his wife, Margaret, came from a wealthy family of her own. Margaret was respected in social circles, and Richard depended on her image to hold up his empire. If he left her, the scandal would stain his name forever. Annika realized that her place in his life would always be hidden in the shadows, no matter how many gifts he showered her with. She wanted more than secrets. She wanted permanence. Her desperation grew until it turned into an idea. One evening, while staring at her student visa documents under the dim light of her apartment, she began to craft a plan. She convinced herself that Richard could be her way out, not through love, but through paperwork. He was a powerful businessman, with companies under his name, and the kind of influence most people could only dream of. If he could sponsor her under one of his companies, she could gain permanent residency without needing to marry him. She could stay in Canada legally, build her career, and secure a future that no one could take away. It sounded simple, but the more she researched, the more complicated it became. To sponsor her, Richard would need to create convincing employment records, and the government would scrutinize every detail. That was when she heard about a man known only as the Fixer. Whispers of his name traveled through the international student community like a dangerous secret. He specialized in helping desperate foreigners with fake documentation, building flawless stories that could trick immigration officers. His services were expensive, and his clients rarely spoke about him openly, but Annika tracked him down through a classmate who had once used his services. The fixer met her in a quiet diner on the edge of town. He was middle-aged with sharp eyes and a smile that never touched his face. He listened as she explained her situation and then laid out his offer. For a large sum of money, he would create the paperwork she needed. Fake employment contracts, pay stubs, even bank records, it would all look real. All she needed was someone credible, like Richard, to tie his company name to the documents. The fixer promised that once her residency was approved, she could cut ties, and no one would be the wiser. Annika hesitated at first. The cost was overwhelming, but she knew Richard's generosity could cover it. She framed the request carefully when she brought it up to him, presenting it as a small business sponsorship, a harmless way to help her career. Richard, blinded by his affection and perhaps by guilt for the life he had pulled her into, agreed. He paid the fixer without question, trusting Annika's judgment. What he did not realize was that his name and his company were now tied directly to fraudulent activity. For a short while, everything seemed to fall into place. The fixer delivered the documents exactly as promised. Annika looked at the fake records and felt a rush of relief. They were perfect, polished, and convincing. She believed the nightmare of returning to India was finally behind her. Richard seemed unfazed, confident that his wealth and influence would shield them from any danger. Annika allowed herself to relax, imagining a life where she was not just a mistress in the shadows, but a woman with legal standing in Canada. But cracks began to appear almost immediately. Richard's accountant noticed unusual money transfers to unfamiliar accounts. Strange calls started arriving at his office, asking questions about his companies that did not sound like normal business inquiries. He brushed them off at first, but a seed of worry grew inside him. His empire was built on reputation, and even the smallest hint of fraud could collapse everything he had built. He began to wonder if helping Annika had been a mistake. Annika, however, ignored the warning signs. She had grown bold, her confidence boosted by the security she thought she had achieved. She started making bigger demands, nicer apartments, more expensive gifts, and more money funneled to the fixer. She told herself it was necessary to keep the man satisfied, but in truth, she was feeding her own hunger for the life she had stepped into. The fixer noticed her desperation and took advantage of it, raising his fees and pressing for more cash with every new stage of paperwork. What Annika did not realize was that the fixer had no loyalty to her. He worked only for profit, and he was already setting her up as the fall person if the scam unraveled. He began collecting evidence that tied her directly to the fraud while keeping Richard's involvement vague. He knew that when authorities came knocking, it would be Annika who stood exposed while he disappeared into the shadows. At the same time, Richard's wife, Margaret, began noticing his absences. She had long suspected his infidelity, but had chosen to ignore it for the sake of her image. Now, however, something felt different. He was more distracted, more nervous, and more careless with his lies. Margaret hired a private investigator, determined to uncover the truth. It did not take long before the investigator spotted Richard with Annika, following them discreetly and snapping photos as they dined in private restaurants and entered hotels under false names. The investigator also picked up threads of Annika's dealings with people connected to immigration scams. Margaret was no fool. She pieced together enough to see that her husband was not just betraying her with a younger woman, he was getting entangled in something dangerous that could tarnish their family's name. She quietly gathered the evidence, waiting for the right moment to use it against him. Meanwhile, Annika's anxiety grew. The fixer demanded more money, warning her that the authorities were already suspicious of Richard's company. She begged Richard for additional funds, framing it as a necessary step to protect him. Richard, weary and torn between fear and desire, complied. Yet in the back of his mind, he wondered if Annika was using him not out of love, but out of calculation. The tension between them was invisible to outsiders, but it was building rapidly. Annika's dreams of permanence, Richard's fear of exposure, the fixer's greed, and Margaret's silent watchfulness, all of it was converging into a storm. Neither Annika nor Richard realized that they were already standing on the edge of disaster. one step away from a fall that would shatter both their lives. Richard Callahan had built his empire on caution and careful planning, but for the first time in decades, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The whispers of fraud had reached his lawyers, and the immigration authorities had begun poking into one of his shell companies. At first, he dismissed it as routine, a minor inconvenience that could be brushed aside with money or influence. But the more he learned, the more he realized the trail led directly back to Annika. Documents bore his company's name. Financial transfers linked him to transactions he had never approved, and anonymous tips pointed investigators toward the possibility of a visa scam. Richard's stomach tightened with fear each time his phone buzzed, each time his secretary told him a government office had called. He was a man who valued control, and now control was slipping away like sand between his fingers. He confronted Annika in private one evening, expecting guilt or fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him even more. She was calm, almost defiant, and behind her careful expression, there was a flicker of power. She reminded him, without saying it outright, that if he abandoned her, she could ruin him in ways he could not imagine. The scandal of their affair alone could cripple his reputation. If the press discovered not only his betrayal of Margaret, but also his connection to a fraudulent immigration scheme, everything he had worked for would collapse. His fortune, his businesses, his name gone in an instant. Annika had transformed from the timid student he once met into someone far more calculating. She no longer begged for help. She demanded it. Every gesture, every word suggested she understood the leverage she held over him. Richard was trapped, but he could not bring himself to let her go. He told himself he still cared for her, but in truth, it was fear that bound him tighter than affection ever could. Behind the curtain of their private battles, the fixer was tightening his grip. He contacted Annika with increasing frequency, each time with fresh threats veiled in polite words. He warned her that Richard's accountants were sniffing around, that immigration was circling closer, that leaks could happen at any moment unless more money changed hands. Annika, too terrified to resist, kept going back to Richard for funds. But Richard was no longer the indulgent benefactor he once had been. His generosity soured into resentment, and he began to see her not as a lover but as the source of every problem threatening to consume him. The walls were closing in from every direction. Margaret's private investigator had gathered enough photographs and notes to confirm the affair beyond doubt. He followed Annika through dim streets and upscale restaurants, capturing her meetings with unfamiliar men linked to shady immigration circles. When he handed the evidence to Margaret, she felt a cold sense of satisfaction. For years, she had endured Richard's infidelities, swallowing her pride to maintain her position as the wife of a wealthy man. But this time was different. This affair was reckless, dangerous, and tied to a scandal that could ruin her as well. She saw an opportunity, not only for revenge but for control. With the evidence in her hands, she had the power to destroy both Richard and Annika, and she was determined to use it when the moment was right. As the investigation tightened, Richard grew paranoid. He spent sleepless nights pacing in his study, chain-smoking cigars, imagining headlines splashed across newspapers, imagining Margaret's icy glare in the courtroom as his empire crumbled. His mind circled endlessly, looking for an escape that never appeared. Each time he looked at Annika, he saw not the vibrant young woman who had once excited him, but a ticking time bomb. He began canceling meetings with her, ignoring her calls and pushing her away. But Annika was not willing to be discarded. Annika sensed his withdrawal and panicked. The fixer's threats had escalated. He spoke of files he could release to the authorities, naming her as the mastermind behind the scam. She feared he was already preparing to betray her. If Richard cut ties now, she would be left alone to face the consequences. Her dreams of permanence in Canada, her carefully built life of luxury, all of it would crumble. She pressed harder, cornering Richard into conversations he didn't want to have, reminding him of everything she could expose. Each meeting between them grew darker, each exchange charged with anger and fear. The tension reached a breaking point one afternoon when immigration officers visited Richard's office unannounced. They asked pointed questions about one of his companies, producing documents that bore forged signatures. Richard managed to mask his panic, but as soon as they left, he realized how dire the situation had become. Someone had tipped them off. He knew instinctively it was the fixer, playing both sides for profit. Richard considered going to the authorities himself, confessing just enough to save his skin and shift the blame onto Annika. But the thought of public humiliation, of Margaret learning the full extent of his betrayal, froze him in place. Meanwhile, Margaret began her own quiet maneuvering. She arranged meetings with lawyers under the guise of estate planning, testing the waters of what a divorce settlement might look like if she filed with evidence of Richard S. affair and financial misconduct. She did not want only to leave him. She wanted to bleed him dry, to take everything he valued as punishment for years of humiliation. Annika, though unaware of Margaret's precise moves, sensed the invisible hand working against her. Strange people seemed to follow her on the street. She received anonymous calls that ended in silence. She began looking over her shoulder constantly, trapped between fear of the fixer, fear of Richard abandoning her, and fear of Margaret's unseen wrath. The fixer, true to form, was preparing his escape. He had milked Annika for all the money he could and now sought new clients to replace her. In the shadows, he forged a new set of documents that painted Annika as the sole orchestrator of the visa scam, keeping Richard's involvement conveniently vague. To him, it was simple survival. If the authorities came down hard, he would offer Annika as the sacrificial lamb while he vanished without a trace. Richard, pushed to the edge, began drinking more heavily. His staff noticed his erratic moods, his sudden outbursts, his tendency to lock himself away for hours. The polished businessman who once inspired all was unraveling, and rumors started to circulate among his employees. Margaret watched silently, her satisfaction growing as she prepared her strike. Annika, frantic and cornered, began plotting her own way out. The stage was set, though none of them realized it. Richard wanted escape, Margaret wanted revenge, Annika wanted survival, and the fixer wanted profit. Each of them moved like pieces on a board, unaware of how close they were to collision. By the time they saw the disaster coming, it would already be too late. The rain that night came down in heavy sheets, washing over the city as if trying to cleanse it of the secrets it carried. Richard Callahan sat in his luxury condo, staring at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had chosen this place carefully years ago, a hidden retreat away from the eyes of his family, colleagues, and the press. It had always been a sanctuary for his affairs, a place where he could indulge in desires without consequences. But tonight the sanctuary felt like a prison. He had asked Annika to meet him there with a heavy heart, knowing that their arrangement had spiraled far beyond what he could control. Annika arrived drenched from the storm, her hair clinging to her face, her eyes sharp with a mix of fear and defiance. She sensed something the moment she walked into the condo. The lights were dim, the air heavy, and Richard's expression was colder than she had ever seen. She knew this was not a meeting of affection, this was an ending. Richard had rehearsed the words in his mind all day. He was going to cut ties, end the affair, and sever every financial connection. The investigations were closing in, Margaret was circling with evidence, and the fixer was tightening his noose. He believed that by walking away, by sacrificing Annika, he could salvage what remained of his empire. He underestimated her resolve. Annika had come prepared for a confrontation. The fixer had whispered to her earlier that Richard planned to betray her, that he was ready to feed her to the authorities to save himself. Whether it was true or simply another manipulation from a man who thrived on chaos, she did not know. But she believed it, and the fear hardened into rage during her walk through the storm. She entered that condo not as the frightened student who once clung to Richard's wealth, but as someone ready to fight for her survival. The argument escalated quickly. Richard's tone was final, his words laced with frustration and contempt. He blamed her for dragging him into fraud, for draining him of money, for endangering everything he had worked for. He told her it was over. Annika stood her ground, her voice steady, her eyes burning. She reminded him of the evidence she held, of the scandal she could unleash if he abandoned her. She spoke of the fixer, of the documents, of the people who already knew too much. Her survival depended on him, and she would not let him cast her aside. The storm outside roared, wind rattling the windows, thunder echoing in the distance. Inside, the storm between them reached its breaking point. Richard's anger erupted in a burst of violence. He slammed his fist on the glass table, his face twisted with rage, his threats echoing in the room. Annika felt cornered, her pulse racing, her breath sharp and uneven. In a desperate act, she reached for the heavy glass ornament sitting on the table, a decorative piece Richard had collected during one of his business trips. The moment unfolded in an instant. She swung it with both hands, striking his temple with brutal force. Richard's eyes widened in shock, his body crumpling to the floor in eerie silence. The sound of the impact still rang in her ears as she dropped the ornament, her chest heaving with disbelief. She had not intended to kill him, not at first, but now he lay motionless, his blood slowly spreading across the polished floor. Panic consumed her. She staggered back, her hands trembling, her mind spinning. She told herself she had no choice, that it was self-defense, that he would have destroyed her if she had let him go through with his plan. But panic left little room for reason. Her instincts screamed at her to cover her tracks. She stumbled through the condo, scattering drawers, overturning items, breaking a vase, trying to make the scene look like a robbery gone wrong. She wiped surfaces clumsily, but in her haste she left behind smudges, prints, and traces of her presence that no careful investigator would miss. She grabbed her bag, shoved her wet hair under a hood, and rushed out into the rain-soaked night. The elevator ride felt endless, her reflection in the mirrored walls pale and distorted. By the time she stepped onto the street, her heart pounded so violently she could barely breathe. She told herself no one had seen her, that the storm would erase her tracks, that she could disappear into the night. But she was wrong. Margaret's private investigator, who had been tailing Annika for weeks, was parked nearby. Through the blurry windshield, he watched her leave the condo in a hurry, her movements frantic and suspicious. He lifted his camera, snapping photos that captured her fleeing the scene. He did not yet know what had happened inside, but he had enough to fuel Margaret's suspicions. When the police arrived hours later, called by a concerned neighbor who had heard a loud crash before silence, they found Richard Callahan's lifeless body sprawled on the floor. The blood had dried, the glass ornament lay nearby, and the signs of a staged robbery were obvious. But to trained investigators, the scene told a different story. The overturned drawers looked unnatural. The broken items scattered without purpose, and there were no signs of forced entry. The conclusion was clear: this was not a burglary. It was something far more personal. Detectives worked through the night, collecting evidence, dusting for prints, and piecing together the events. Annika's fingerprints were discovered on the weapon, her DNA on a glass she had drunk from earlier that evening. Security cameras captured her entering the building, though the storm blurred her departure. The timeline was tight, the evidence damning. Within hours, her name moved to the top of the suspect list. News of Richard's death spread quickly. By morning, the media swarmed the condo, broadcasting images of the wealthy businessman's tragic end. Whispers of scandal circulated through Toronto's elite circles. Some speculated it was a deal gone wrong, others whispered about an affair. Margaret, watching from her estate, felt no grief, only cold vindication. She knew Annika had been involved, and soon everyone else would know too. Annika, hiding in her apartment, tried to convince herself she could still escape. She rehearsed stories in her head, imagined blaming the fixer, imagined running before the police arrived. But every knock at the door, every siren in the distance, made her jump. She could feel the noose tightening around her neck. She knew it was only a matter of time before the world discovered the truth of what had happened that stormy night in Richard Callahan's secret condo. The trial that followed Richard Callahan's death became one of the most sensational cases in Canada's recent history. Newspapers ran his photo on the front page for weeks, showing the silver-haired millionaire who had built a fortune from real estate and technology investments. At first, the public mourned him as a respected businessman whose life had been cut short by a senseless act of violence. But as investigators dug deeper, the story shifted into something far darker, filled with scandal, betrayal, and lies. Annika was arrested only days after Richard's body was discovered. Police arrived at her apartment before dawn, pounding on the door until she answered, trembling and disoriented. They handcuffed her in front of her neighbors, who watched from their doorways in shocked silence. The young student they thought was chasing an education had suddenly become the face of a high-profile murder. The officers searched her apartment, seizing documents, laptops, and traces of her connection to the fixer. Within hours, her name was splashed across every major news outlet. The prosecution built their case on the trail of evidence left behind. Annika's fingerprints were found on the glass ornament used to strike Richard, and her DNA was on items inside the condo. Security footage placed her at the building on the night of his death. Witnesses described her presence in Richard's life, from waiters at expensive restaurants to neighbors who had seen her entering his secret apartment. The narrative presented was damning. A desperate student who had seduced a married millionaire, drained his money, and killed him when he threatened to cut her off. Courtrooms filled with reporters, each hungry for every detail. Television programs dissected her outfits, her expressions, her body language. Commentators debated whether she was a cold manipulator or a victim of circumstance. To some, she was a cunning woman who plotted her way into Richard's wealth, only to destroy him when her scheme fell apart. To others, she was a vulnerable immigrant who had been used and discarded by a powerful man, pushed into a corner until she snapped. The fixer played a crucial role in her downfall. Under pressure from investigators, he offered testimony in exchange for leniency. He admitted to running the fraudulent visa operation but shifted the weight of blame onto Annika, describing her as the instigator who sought his services and pressured Richard into financing it. He painted himself as a facilitator who had been drawn into her manipulation, a claim investigators knew was selective but useful enough to secure a conviction. His testimony sealed her fate. Margaret Callahan sat in the front row of the courtroom each day, perfectly composed, dressed in black as though attending an endless funeral. She never shed a tear for her husband, but her presence spoke volumes. To the public, she was the wronged wife watching justice unfold. Privately, she savored the spectacle, knowing the young woman who had threatened her marriage and her status was now shackled, humiliated, and facing the weight of the law. The photographs taken by her investigator were quietly handed to prosecutors, ensuring that Annika's ties to Richard could no longer be denied. Annika's defense team argued that the killing was not premeditated, that she had acted out of fear and panic during a heated confrontation. They emphasized her youth, her struggles as an international student, and the pressure she had faced from both Richard and the fixer. They painted a picture of a woman caught in a trap she could not escape, a woman whose desperation clouded her judgment. But the jury saw a different story. They saw the calculated steps she had taken, the documents she had falsified, the manipulation she had wielded against Richard. They saw a woman who had chosen greed and survival over morality. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day peeling back new layers of deceit. Reporters described it as a tragic tale of ambition colliding with corruption. Richard's business partners testified about the shockwaves his death sent through his empire. Former employees described how the investigations into fraud had already begun to cripple the company even before his murder. Immigration officials revealed the forged paperwork, linking Annika directly to fraudulent sponsorship schemes. Piece by piece, the case against her grew heavier, and her chances of escape dwindled. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom fell silent. The jury foreman announced her guilty of second-degree murder and fraud-related charges. The sentence was life in prison, with no chance of parole for years. Annika stood motionless as the words sank in. Her face, once filled with hope and determination when she first arrived in Canada, now carried only exhaustion and disbelief. She was led away in handcuffs, her future reduced to cold walls and steel bars. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as crowds shouted their opinions. Some cheered at the conviction, calling it justice for a man betrayed by a manipulative lover. Others murmured that the story was more complicated, that Richard's power and privilege had played a role in shaping Annika's downfall. But in the end, the law had spoken, and the young woman who came to Canada seeking a better life would spend her days behind prison walls. Richard's empire crumbled in the aftermath. His businesses collapsed under the weight of investigations, lawsuits, and financial losses. Investors fled, and the Callahan name, once synonymous with success, became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Margaret emerged unscathed, her inheritance secure, her reputation carefully preserved. She sold off parts of the empire, distanced herself from the scandals, and resumed her place in high society as though nothing had happened. For Annika, prison became a mirror of the life she had tried so hard to escape. The cold cement walls echoed the confinement she had feared back in India, only now it was worse. She had no freedom, no wealth, no dreams left to chase. Her story was reduced to tabloid headlines and documentaries dissecting her every move. Her name became a symbol of ambition gone wrong, a warning to others about the dangers of deception. Years later, people still remembered the case. Documentaries replayed her trial, journalists wrote retrospectives, and her story was told again and again as a tragedy of greed, power, and desperation. What had begun as a young woman's quest for a better life ended as a cautionary tale of how quickly dreams could turn into nightmares. In the end, the affair, the visa scam, and the murder all became pieces of a larger story that captivated the public, the rise and fall of Annika Sharma, the student, who tried to outwit the system and instead destroyed herself in the process. The legacy she left behind was not of success or survival, but of a deadly scandal that proved how ambition, lies, and betrayal could spiral into consequences no one could escape.